The dust devil swirled across the parched Kansas earth, and through its hazy veil, Sarah Ramsey watched her father's coffin being lowered into the ground, knowing that buried with him was the last protection she had in this unforgiving world. The year was 1878, and the small gathering of mourners around the grave site outside Linden, Kansas, consisted of barely a dozen people. Most of them were neighboring ranchers who had come out of obligation rather than true friendship, their weathered faces betraying their eagerness to return to their own pressing concerns. Sarah stood straight-backed in her black mourning dress, her chestnut hair pulled severely back from her pale face, fighting the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. At 22 years old, she had already lost her mother to consumption 3 years prior, and now her father had succumbed to a heart attack while mending fences on their modest 100-acre farm. The preacher droned on with his rehearsed words of comfort, but Sarah heard none of them. Her mind raced with the brutal calculations of survival. The farm had debts her father had incurred trying to keep the place running after a particularly harsh winter had decimated their cattle herd. She had perhaps 2 months before the bank would come calling, and she had no idea how she would make the payments. Her father had taught her to ride and shoot, to mend fences and tend livestock, but he had shielded her from the true state of their finances until it was far too late. When the service ended, Sarah accepted the mumbled condolences with wooden politeness, barely registering the faces before her until one man remained. Vernon Pierce was a man of perhaps 50 years, his gut straining against his fancy vest, his jowly face sporting mutton-chop whiskers that had gone gray years ago. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties and controlled half the businesses in Linden. His small, calculating eyes studied Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Ramsey, a word if I may," Pierce said, his voice oily with false sympathy. "I understand your father left behind certain financial obligations." Sarah's spine stiffened. "That is a private matter, Mr. Pierce. Private indeed, until the bank forecloses. Your father owed $1,200, did he not? And the bank will want their money in 60 days. Pierce stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "I am prepared to make you an offer." "I am not interested in selling," Sarah said firmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. Pierce's smile was predatory. "I am not offering to buy, Miss Ramsey. I am offering to assume your father's debts in exchange for your hand in marriage. You would retain ownership of your farm, and I would gain a comely young wife. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement." The audacity of the proposal left Sarah momentarily speechless. She had heard rumors about Vernon Pierce, whispers that his first wife had died under suspicious circumstances, that he treated his ranch hands little better than slaves, that his business dealings often skirted the edge of legality. The thought of marrying such a man, of allowing him into her bed, made her stomach turn. "I must respectfully decline," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Pierce's expression darkened. "You have 60 days to reconsider, Miss Ramsey. When you come crawling to me with nowhere else to turn, I may not be so generous with my terms." He tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy and walked away, leaving Sarah alone among the graves. The following weeks passed in a blur of desperate activity. Sarah sold off everything she could spare, including her mother's jewelry and the few pieces of good furniture in the farmhouse. She tried to find work in town, but the respectable establishments would not hire a young woman without a male family member to vouch for her character, and the less respectable ones offered employment she would rather starve than accept. The debts loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon, growing darker with each passing day. 45 days after her father's funeral, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open before her, the numbers swimming before her tired eyes. She had $900, scraped together through the sale of nearly everything of value. She was still $300 short, and there was nothing left to sell except the land itself and the few remaining head of cattle. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and Sarah felt a suffocating despair settle over her like a shroud. A knock at the door startled her from her dark thoughts. When she opened it, she found herself facing Vernon Pierce once again, but this time he was not alone. Behind him stood the banker, Silas Morton, and the county sheriff, a thin man named Webb who was known to be in Pierce's pocket. "Miss Ramsey, I'm afraid I have unfortunate news," Morton said, his voice apologetic but his eyes hard. "Mr. Pierce has purchased your father's debt from the bank. As the new holder of the note, he is within his rights to call it due immediately." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You cannot do that." "I still have 2 weeks. The original agreement was with the bank," Morton replied. "Mr. Pierce is under no obligation to honor those terms. You owe him $1,200, payable immediately, or he can seize the property to satisfy the debt." Pierce stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. "However, Miss Ramsey, I am still willing to offer you an alternative. Marry me today and the debt will be forgiven. You will have a home, security, and the protection of my name. Refuse, and Sheriff Webb will escort you off this property within the hour." The trap had been sprung with ruthless efficiency, and Sarah saw now that Pierce had been planning this all along. He had waited until she had exhausted all other options, until she was cornered and desperate, before moving in for the kill. She looked from Pierce's smug face to the sheriff's impassive expression to the banker's carefully neutral gaze, and knew she had no allies here. "I need time to think," Sarah said desperately. "You have until I count to 10, Pierce replied coldly. 1, 2, 3. Sarah's mind raced, searching for any escape, any alternative, but found none. She could refuse, lose the farm her parents had built, and end up destitute on the streets of Linden. Or she could accept Pierce's proposal and condemn herself to a marriage that would be little more than slavery. Both options felt like death sentences, but at least marriage would give her a roof over her head. 7, 8. "I accept," Sarah heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. Pierce's smile was triumphant. "Wise decision, my dear. We will ride into town immediately and have the preacher make it official. Sheriff Webb and Mr. Morton can serve as witnesses." The wedding ceremony was mercifully brief. The preacher, aware that something was amiss but unwilling to challenge Vernon Pierce's authority in the community, rushed through the vows with obvious discomfort. Sarah spoke her part mechanically, feeling as though she were watching the scene from outside her own body. When Pierce placed the ring on her finger, a gaudy gold band that had belonged to his first wife, Sarah fought the urge to rip it off and throw it in his face. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher said weakly. Pierce's kiss was possessive and brutal, his thick lips crushing against hers, his hand gripping the back of her neck to prevent her from pulling away. When he finally released her, Sarah tasted blood from where her lip had split against her teeth. "Come, wife," Pierce said with satisfaction. "We will collect your belongings and remove to my ranch. That pitiful farm of yours will be sold to cover the remaining expenses." "You said I could keep the farm," Sarah protested, her voice rising in panic. "I said you would retain ownership, and you have, until this very moment. Now, as my wife, all your property belongs to me under the law. The farm is mine to dispose of as I see fit." Pierce's smile was cruel. Surely you did not think I would let you maintain that pathetic little homestead when I have a proper ranch for you to mistress." Sarah realized then the full extent of her mistake. She had been outmaneuvered at every turn, and now she was bound to this man by law and custom, with no recourse and no escape. The trip back to the farm to collect her few remaining possessions passed in numb silence. When they arrived at Pierce's ranch, a sprawling affair with a main house that spoke of wealth and power, Sarah was shown to the master bedroom with its enormous four-poster bed, and told to prepare herself for her wedding night. She stood in the center of that ornate room, surrounded by the trappings of luxury purchased with blood and exploitation, and felt the full weight of her situation crushed down upon her. When Pierce entered the room hours later, reeking of whiskey and triumph, Sarah closed her eyes and retreated to a place deep inside herself where his hands could not reach. She endured what followed with silent tears streaming down her face, and when it was finally over and Pierce lay snoring beside her, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she would have the courage to end her own suffering. The days that followed blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. Sarah discovered that being Vernon Pierce's wife was even worse than she had imagined. He was a tyrant who ruled his household with an iron fist, demanding obedience in all things and punishing any perceived slight with verbal abuse and, increasingly, physical violence. Sarah learned to keep her eyes downcast, her voice soft, and her opinions to herself. She became a ghost in her own life, moving through the days with mechanical efficiency, performing the duties expected of her while her spirit withered inside her skin. Pierce kept her isolated at the ranch, forbidding her from going to town without his express permission, and never allowing her to go alone. The ranch hands knew better than to speak to her beyond what was absolutely necessary, and the few female servants in the house treated her with a mixture of pity and wariness. Sarah understood that she was not the first woman to be trapped in this gilded cage, and the fate of Pierce's first wife served as a grim warning to anyone who might think to challenge his authority. Winter came to Kansas with brutal force, blanketing the prairie in snow and ice. Sarah spent long hours staring out the window at the frozen landscape, feeling as cold and barren inside as the world outside. Pierce traveled frequently on business, and those brief absences were the only respite Sarah had from his oppressive presence. During those times, she would sometimes slip out to the barn where the horses were kept, finding solace in the warm presence of the animals who asked nothing of her and judged her not at all. It was during one of these solitary visits to the barn, on a particularly bitter day in January of 1879, that Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She had received word that morning that her family farm had been sold to a consortium of businessmen from back east for a fraction of its true value, with all the proceeds going directly to Pierce. The last tangible connection to her parents was gone, severed as cleanly as a knife cut, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She sank down into the hay in an empty stall and wept, great racking sobs that tore from her throat and echoed through the barn. She cried for her parents, for her lost freedom, for the future she would never have. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was empty and hollow and past all feeling. She did not hear the barn door open, did not realize she was no longer alone until a gentle voice spoke from above her. "Madam, are you hurt?" Sarah's head jerked up, and she found herself looking at a man she did not recognize. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn canvas jacket. His face was lean and tanned from hours in the sun, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of summer sky. He held his hat in his hands, and regarded her with obvious concern, making no move to come closer or intrude further upon her private grief. "I am fine," Sarah said automatically, scrubbing at her tear-stained face with the back of her hand. "Who are you?" "Name is Henry Lawson, madam. I just hired on this morning as a ranch hand. I was settling my horse when I heard you crying. I apologize for the intrusion." He moved as if to leave, but something in Sarah's expression must have stopped him because he hesitated. "Are you sure you are all right? Do you need me to fetch someone?" The genuine kindness in his voice, so different from the calculated cruelty she had become accustomed to, made Sarah's throat tighten with fresh tears. "No, please. Do not tell anyone you found me here. Mr. Pierce does not like it when I come to the barn." Henry's expression darkened slightly. "You are Mrs. Pierce, then. I should have realized. Again, I apologize for disturbing you." "It is all right," Sarah said softly. "Truly, it was kind of you to check on me." They regarded each other for a long moment, and Sarah felt something pass between them, some spark of recognition or understanding that she could not quite name. Henry had kind eyes, she thought, and strong hands that held his hat gently rather than crushing it. He looked like a man who could be trusted, and Sarah had not met anyone she could trust in so very long. "I will leave you to your privacy, madam," Henry said at last, settling his hat back on his head. "But if you ever need help with anything at all, you just let me know." "It would be my honor." He left before Sarah could respond, and she sat in the hay for a long time afterward, turning their brief conversation over in her mind. She told herself not to read too much into it, that he was simply being polite, that she was a fool for feeling anything at all. But that night, lying rigid in the darkness beside her snoring husband, Sarah allowed herself to think of kind blue eyes and a gentle voice, and for the first time in months, she felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. Henry Lawson, it turned out, was different from the other ranch hands. Sarah learned through careful observation over the following weeks that he was a drifter, working his way across the territories and taking jobs where he could find them. He was a skilled horseman and a hard worker, and even Pierce, who was difficult to please, seemed satisfied with his performance. But more than that, Henry possessed a quiet integrity that set him apart from the rough men who populated the bunkhouse. He was polite to everyone, even those below his station, and Sarah never heard him join in the crude jokes and coarse laughter that characterized the other hands' conversations. She tried not to seek him out, tried not to let her eyes linger when she saw him working in the corrals or riding out with the other men to check the fence lines. But despite her best efforts, Sarah found herself aware of his presence with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. When their paths crossed in the yard or the barn, they would exchange brief pleasantries, always careful to maintain propriety, always conscious of the watching eyes that reported everything back to Pierce. But there were moments, stolen seconds when no one else was looking, when their gazes would meet and hold, and Sarah would feel that same spark of connection she had felt that first day in the barn. She began to live for those moments, hoarding them like precious coins against the poverty of her daily existence. March brought the first signs of spring, and with it, an increase in Pierce's business activities. He was away from the ranch more often, sometimes for days at a time, and during these absences, Sarah found her movements slightly less restricted. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Martha who had served Pierce for 20 years, seemed to take pity on Sarah and would occasionally allow her to take short walks around the property unchaperoned, provided she stayed within sight of the house. It was on one of these walks that Sarah encountered Henry again, this time under less distressing circumstances. He was working to repair a section of fence near the house, His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, his movements economical and efficient. When he saw Sarah approaching, he straightened and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, Mrs. Pierce. Fine day, is it not?" "It is," Sarah agreed, stopping a respectful distance away. The winter was so long I had begun to forget what sunshine felt like. "I expect Kansas winters can be brutal for those not accustomed to them. Where did you grow up, if you do not mind my asking?" Henry returned to his work as he spoke, giving their conversation the appearance of casual chat rather than anything more significant. "Here in Linden," Sarah replied. "My parents had a farm just east of town. A small place, but it was home." "Had you sold it?" The question was innocent enough, but it touched on the raw wound of Sarah's loss. "My father died last year, and I was forced to marry to settle his debts. My husband sold the farm out from under me." Henry's hand stilled on the fence post, and when he looked at her, his eyes were sharp with understanding. "Forced to marry, that is a hard way to put it, madam." "It is the truth," Sarah said quietly. She knew she was being incautious, revealing too much to someone who was essentially a stranger, but something about Henry invited confidence. "Vernon Pierce bought my father's debt and gave me a choice between marriage and destitution. I chose poorly." "I do not think you chose poorly, madam. I think you were given no real choice at all, and you did what you had to in order to survive. That takes courage, not weakness." Henry's voice was gentle but firm, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected validation. "Most days I feel more like a coward than anything else," she admitted. "You are no coward. A coward would have given up by now. You are still here, still standing, still fighting in your own way. That counts for something." They stood in silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the prairie grass. Sarah knew she should return to the house before her absence was noted, but she was reluctant to end this conversation, this brief connection with someone who saw her as a person rather than a possession. "Why did you come to work here?" she asked suddenly. "Surely you must have heard stories about Vernon Pierce and how he treats his people." Henry's jaw tightened slightly. "I heard stories, but I needed the work, and I try not to judge a situation until I have seen it with my own eyes. Now that I have been here a few weeks, I can say the stories do not do justice to the reality. This is not a good place, Mrs. Pierce, and your husband is not a good man, if you will forgive me for saying so." "There is nothing to forgive. You speak only the truth." Sarah glanced back toward the house, where Martha had appeared on the porch to shake out a rug. "I should go. Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Lawson. It has been a long time since anyone spoke to me as though I were a real person." "You are real, madam, more real than most people I have met. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Henry's eyes held hers for a long moment, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, some long, dormant part of herself stirring to life. Then she turned and walked back to the house, acutely conscious of his gaze following her every step. That night, Pierce returned from his trip in a foul mood, having lost a significant sum in a business deal gone sour. He took his anger out on Sarah with a viciousness that left bruises on her arms and a split lip that she could not hide. The next morning, when she emerged from her room with her face carefully composed despite the evidence of violence, she saw Henry in the yard and watched his expression darken with barely controlled rage when he saw her injuries. He said nothing, did nothing, but Sarah saw his hands clench into fists at his sides and knew that he understood exactly what had happened. The knowledge that someone cared, that someone saw and was angry on her behalf, was both comforting and terrifying. She could not afford for anyone to challenge Pierce on her account, could not bear the thought of Henry losing his position or worse, because he felt compelled to defend her honor. But as the weeks passed, Sarah found it increasingly difficult to maintain the walls she had built around her heart. Henry had a way of appearing whenever she needed help with some small task, always with a plausible excuse for his presence, always careful to maintain propriety. He would carry heavy baskets for her, repair broken equipment before she had to ask, leave small gifts where only she would find them. A perfect robin's egg, a handful of wildflowers, a smooth stone from the creek bed. These tiny gestures of kindness sustained Sarah through the dark times, gave her something to hold onto when the weight of her situation threatened to crush her. She knew she was falling in love with him, knew it was foolish and dangerous and impossible. She was a married woman, bound by law and church to a man she despised, and Henry was a drifter who would move on sooner or later. There was no future for them, no possibility of happiness. And yet, Sarah could not stop her heart from reaching toward him like a flower toward the sun, desperate for warmth and light. One evening in late April, with Pierce away again on business, Sarah slipped out to the barn after supper. She told herself she was simply checking on the horses, but she knew she was hoping to see Henry. She found him in the tack room, cleaning a saddle by lamplight, and when he saw her, his face lit with pleasure. "Evening, Mrs. Pierce. Something I can help you with." "I just wanted to see the horses," Sarah said, the lie sounding weak even to her own ears. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Never a disturbance, madam. In fact, I was hoping I might have a chance to talk to you. Something has been weighing on my mind." Henry set down the saddle and stood, his expression serious. "I heard some of the other hands talking today. They said Pierce is planning to sell off the cattle herd in a few weeks and use the money to expand his operations into Colorado. He will be taking several of the men with him, me included, and he is planning to take you as well." Sarah's heart sank. "I had not heard anything about this." "I do not think he means to tell you until the last moment, to prevent you from making any plans of your own. Colorado is a long way from here, madam, and from what I understand, he has even fewer legal constraints there than he does in Kansas. If he takes you there, you will be completely under his control with no hope of help from anyone who might remember you or your family." The implications were clear and terrifying. Whatever small freedoms Sarah had managed to retain would vanish entirely once Pierce relocated her to unfamiliar territory. She would be truly lost, and Pierce would have free rein to do whatever he wished without fear of social censure. "What can I do?" Sarah whispered, feeling panic rise in her throat. "I have no money, no resources, nowhere to go. I am trapped." Henry stepped closer, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "You are not trapped, not if you are willing to fight. I have been thinking about this about you more than I probably should. I know it is not my place, and I know you barely know me, but I cannot stand by and watch him destroy you. There has to be a way out. Even if there were, I am married to him. The law gives him rights over me, over everything I have or might have. I cannot simply walk away." Sarah's voice broke on the last word, and she turned away to hide the tears that threatened to spill. She felt Henry's hand, gentle and warm, on her shoulder, and then he was turning her back to face him. They stood close enough that Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather and hay that clung to him. When she looked up into his eyes, what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. "Sarah," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. "I know I have no right to say this, no claim on you, but I need you to know that I care about what happens to you. More than care. I have tried to fight it, tried to tell myself it is wrong to feel this way about another man's wife, but I cannot seem to help myself. You are the finest woman I have ever met, and you deserve so much better than what life has given you." "Henry," Sarah breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. You cannot say such things. If anyone heard, if Pierce found out, he would kill you. Let him try. I am not afraid of Vernon Pierce or any man like him." Henry's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her face. "I am only afraid of losing you, of standing by while he takes you away to Colorado and I never see you again." Sarah knew she should pull away, should put distance between them, should remember her vows and her duty. But she was so tired of being strong, so tired of denying herself any comfort or joy. When Henry lowered his head, she did not resist. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and searching, and Sarah felt something inside her chest break open, releasing a flood of emotion she had been holding back for so long. They broke apart after a moment, both breathing hard, and Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I should not have done that." "Do not apologize," Sarah said fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt. "Do not you dare apologize for showing me kindness when I have known nothing but cruelty for so long. I do not regret it, Henry. I only regret that we cannot have more." "What if we could?" Henry pulled back to look at her, his expression earnest. "What if there were a way for you to be free of him, legally and permanently? Would you take it, even if it meant leaving everything behind and starting over with nothing, in a heartbeat?" Sarah said without hesitation. "But there is no such way. I am bound to him until death, his or mine." "Maybe not. I heard something else today, something that might give us an option." Henry's voice was low and urgent. One of the other hands was talking about how Pierce acquired his land and his initial wealth. Apparently, he did it by forging documents and cheating homesteaders out of their claims back in the early 70s. The man was drunk and probably said more than he should have. But if it is true, Pierce is a fraud and possibly wanted by federal authorities. Sarah's mind raced. But who would believe a ranch hand over Vernon Pierce? He owns half the county, including the sheriff. We would need proof, real evidence that could not be dismissed, and we would need to take it to someone outside Pierce's sphere of influence, someone with the authority to act on it. Henry's eyes were bright with the beginnings of a plan. "I have a friend in Topeka, a federal marshal named Grant who owes me a favor. If we could get proof of Pierce's crimes and get it to Grant, he would have the authority to arrest Pierce and seize his assets pending trial." "And if Pierce is arrested, what happens to me? I am still his wife. If he is convicted of fraud, you could petition for an annulment on the grounds that the marriage was entered into under duress, and that Pierce used illegal funds to force your hand. It is not guaranteed, but it is a chance. More of a chance than you have now." Hope, fragile and terrifying, began to bloom in Sarah's chest. "How would we get this proof?" "Pierce keeps records in his office in the house, documents relating to all his business dealings. If we could get access to them, find something that proves his fraud, we could make copies and get them to the marshal." Henry's expression grew grim. "It would be dangerous. If Pierce caught us, there is no telling what he would do." "I do not care. I would rather die trying to escape than live another year as his prisoner." Sarah's voice was steady and sure. "Tell me what to do, and I will do it." Over the next week they planned carefully. Sarah had limited access to Pierce's office, but she knew his routine, knew when he locked certain drawers and where he kept the keys. Henry had a friend in town who could make photographs of documents quickly and discreetly, provided they could get the originals to him. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Pierce announced that he would be traveling to Kansas City for 3 days to meet with investors, and he would be leaving Sarah behind with instructions to pack her belongings for the move to Colorado. The moment his carriage disappeared down the drive, Sarah went to his office and began her search. The documents she found were even more damning than they had hoped. Pierce had not only forged homestead claims, but had also embezzled money from the very bank that now employed his friend Morton, had participated in cattle rustling, and had bribed numerous officials to look the other way. Sarah's hands shook as she gathered the most incriminating papers and smuggled them out of the house wrapped in a shawl. Henry met her at the edge of the property with 2 horses already saddled. "We need to move fast. My friend in town can photograph these in a few hours, but we need to get them back before Pierce returns or the house staff notices they are missing." They rode hard to Linden, taking back roads to avoid being seen. Henry's friend, a nervous man who ran a photography studio, agreed to help but warned them that what they were doing was dangerous. "Pierce has a long reach," he said as he set up his equipment. "If he finds out I helped you, my business will be ruined." "We will make sure he does not find out," Henry assured him. "Just work quickly." The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Sarah paced the back room of the studio while Henry kept watch at the window, every muscle in his body tense. Finally, the photographer emerged with the completed prints, and they carefully returned the original documents to Sarah's shawl. "Now what?" Sarah asked as they rode back toward the ranch. "Now I take these to Topeka and give them to Marshal Grant. It will take me 2 days of hard riding to get there and back. Can you hold on that long? Can you act as though nothing has happened when Pierce returns?" Sarah thought of the years she had spent hiding her true feelings, playing the role of obedient wife while her spirit screamed in silent rebellion. "Yes, I can do it. But Henry, be careful. If anything happened to you, I do not think I could bear it." Henry reined in his horse and reached across to take her hand. "Nothing is going to happen to me, and nothing is going to happen to you. In 3 days this will all be over and you will be free. I promise you that, Sarah. I promise." They parted at the edge of the ranch property, and Sarah slipped the documents back into Pierce's office while the staff was occupied with supper preparations. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, but her hands were steady as she replaced everything exactly as she had found it. When she finally made it back to her room, she collapsed on the bed and allowed herself to shake with the release of tension. Pierce returned the next evening, tired and irritable from his journey. Sarah played her part perfectly, enduring his rough handling and his complaints with the same silent submission she had always shown. But inside, she was counting the hours until Henry returned, until the trap she had helped to set would finally snap closed around her tormentor. Marshal Grant arrived at the ranch with 6 deputies on the 3rd day, just as the sun was setting. Sarah was in the parlor when she heard the commotion outside, Pierce's raised voice demanding to know what was happening. She moved to the window and saw Henry sitting tall in the saddle beside the marshal, his face grim but determined. "Vernon Pierce, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, bribery, and cattle rustling," Grant announced in a voice that carried across the yard. "I have warrants issued by the federal court in Topeka. You will come peacefully, or my deputies will use force." Pierce's face went purple with rage. "You have no authority here. I own this county, and you are trespassing on my land." "You own nothing, Pierce. All your assets are hereby frozen pending investigation and trial. That includes this ranch, your business holdings in town, and any money you have in the bank. Now, are you going to come quietly, or do I need to have my men restrain you?" For a moment, Sarah thought Pierce might actually fight, might try to resist arrest and get himself shot in the process. But even he was not fool enough to take on 6 armed federal deputies. With a snarl of impotent fury, he allowed himself to be handcuffed and led to a horse. As the deputies prepared to ride out, Henry dismounted and approached the house. Martha answered his knock, and Sarah heard him ask to speak with Mrs. Pierce. A moment later, she was standing face to face with him in the hallway, very aware of the curious eyes of the household staff watching from doorways and around corners. "Mrs. Pierce, I wanted you to know that Marshal Grant will be posting a deputy here to maintain order until the court decides what to do with the property. You are free to stay or go as you wish, and you will not be molested or harassed by anyone. The marshal also wanted me to tell you that he will need your testimony regarding your forced marriage, and that he will support any petition for annulment you wish to file." Sarah felt tears of relief prick her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Thank you for everything." Henry's eyes were warm with unspoken emotion. "No thanks needed, madam. Justice is justice, and every person deserves to be free. I hope you will take advantage of that freedom and build yourself the life you deserve." He turned to go, and panic seized Sarah. "Wait, where will you go? What will you do now?" "I figure I will head out to Colorado like I originally planned. Look for work out that way. A man can always find something to do if he is willing to work hard." Henry's smile was sad. "You take care of yourself, Sarah Ramsey. You are stronger than you know." The use of her maiden name was deliberate, a reminder that she was no longer bound to Pierce, no longer his property. Sarah wanted to call Henry back, wanted to tell him not to go, wanted to throw caution to the wind and beg him to stay, but she knew she could not yet. She was still legally married, still bound by the conventions of society, and any relationship between them would be scandalous until the annulment was finalized. So she watched him walk away and told herself that this was for the best. The next weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Sarah gave her testimony to Marshal Grant, describing in painful detail how Pierce had manipulated her into marriage and how he had treated her afterward. The bruises on her arms and the scars on her back served as physical evidence of abuse, and several of the household staff came forward to corroborate her story. The lawyer Grant recommended filed for annulment on grounds of duress and fraud, and the judge, a stern man from Topeka who had no connection to Pierce, agreed to hear the case. Meanwhile, the investigation into Pierce's criminal activities uncovered even more corruption than the documents had revealed. It turned out that Pierce had been involved in a cattle rustling ring that stretched across 3 territories, and he had ordered the murder of at least 2 homesteaders who had refused to sell him their land. The evidence was overwhelming, and the trial, when it finally began, was a sensation that drew reporters from as far away as Chicago. Sarah attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the courtroom and watching as the man who had terrorized her for a year was systematically broken down by the weight of his crimes. Pierce's lawyers tried every trick they could think of, but the evidence was too solid to be dismissed. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Pierce was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole. All his assets were to be liquidated and distributed among his victims, including the homesteaders he had cheated and the bank he had embezzled from. Sarah's annulment was granted the following week, the judge ruling that the marriage had been invalid from the start due to the coercive circumstances surrounding it. On a warm day in late June of 1879, Sarah Ramsey walked out of the courthouse in Topeka, a free woman. She had nothing to her name except the clothes on her back and a small amount of money the court had allocated to her from Pierce's seized assets. But she was free, truly free, for the first time in over a year, and the sensation was intoxicating. She returned to Linden to find that her family's farm had been included in the assets to be liquidated, and the court was willing to sell it back to her for a nominal fee, far less than what Pierce had sold it for originally. Sarah used nearly all of her money to purchase the farm, and suddenly she was a landowner again, with 100 acres of Kansas prairie and a modest farmhouse that needed work but was sound at its bones. The problem was, Sarah had no livestock, no equipment, and no money left to purchase them. She spent her first night back on the farm sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun set over the fields her father had plowed, and trying to figure out how she was going to make this work. She could take out a loan, but the memory of debt was too fresh and too painful. She could sell off part of the land, but that felt like betraying her father's legacy. Or she could give up and find work in town, but the thought of abandoning the farm again, this time voluntarily, made her chest ache. She was still sitting there, wrestling with impossible choices, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Sarah stood, shading her eyes against the setting sun, and felt her heart stutter in her chest when she recognized the rider. Henry Lawson reined in his horse at the edge of the yard and dismounted, his movements easy and familiar. He looked exactly as Sarah remembered, lean and sun-bronzed, with those kind blue eyes that had haunted her dreams. He approached slowly, holding his hat in his hands, and stopped a respectful distance away. "I heard you got your farm back," he said simply. "Thought you might need some help getting it up and running again." Sarah's throat was tight with emotion. "I thought you had gone to Colorado." "I got as far as the border and then turned around. Could not seem to make myself keep going." Henry's smile was crooked and self-deprecating. "Turns out I have business back in Kansas that needs attending to, if you will have me, that is. I am a good worker, and I do not require much in the way of wages. Room and board would be sufficient until you get back on your feet." "Henry Lawson, you are a terrible liar," Sarah said, her own smile breaking through despite her tears. "You could find better paying work anywhere. Why would you come back here to work for nothing on a broken-down farm?" "Because the woman I love is here, and I would rather be poor and near her than wealthy and alone." Henry took a step closer, his eyes searching her face. "I know I have no right to claim you, Sarah. I know you just got free and probably need time to figure out who you are without someone telling you what to do. But I had to come back, had to at least tell you how I feel and give you the choice. Because choice is what you deserve. The choice to say yes or no, the choice to take a chance or play it safe, the choice to love or not love as your heart dictates." Sarah closed the distance between them, her hands coming up to frame his face. "I do not need time to figure out how I feel, Henry. I have known for months. I love you, have loved you since that day in the barn when you looked at me and saw a person instead of property. I love you and I want you here, not as a hired hand but as my partner, if you are willing." Henry's answer was to kiss her, slow and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and laughed, the sound joyous and free. "I am willing," he said, "more than willing. I will help you rebuild this farm, Sarah Ramsey, and I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret giving me a chance." They were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Linden 3 months later, in September, when the prairie grass had turned gold, and the air carried the first hint of autumn crispness. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Henry wore his best shirt and a new pair of pants purchased for the occasion. The gathering was small, just a few neighbors and the preacher, but it was joyful in a way Sarah's first wedding had not been. When Henry slipped the ring on her finger, a plain gold band they had picked out together, Sarah felt nothing but happiness and hope for the future. The first year of their marriage was hard work. They had to rebuild the farm from the ground up. purchasing a few head of cattle with money Henry had saved from his drifting days, repairing fences and buildings that had fallen into disrepair, plowing fields and planting crops. They worked from dawn until dusk, side by side, and fell into bed each night exhausted but content. Henry proved to be everything Sarah had hoped and more. He was patient when she struggled with the heavier work, encouraging when she doubted her own abilities, and unfailingly kind even when they were both frustrated and tired. He consulted her on every decision, treating her as a true partner rather than a subordinate. And at night, when they lay together in the darkness, he held her close and whispered words of love that made her feel cherished and safe. By the spring of 1880, the farm was beginning to thrive again. Their small herd had grown, and they had planted wheat that was coming up green and strong. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy on Henry's face when she told him made her cry happy tears. They spent long evenings planning for the future, talking about names for the baby and what additions they would need to make to the house. Their daughter, Emily, was born on a snowy day in December, a healthy baby with her mother's chestnut hair and her father's blue eyes. Henry was present for the birth, holding Sarah's hand through the pain and crying openly when he heard his daughter's first wail. Watching him cradle the tiny infant in his large, work-roughened hands, Sarah felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This was her family, built on love and respect and hard work, and no one could ever take it away from her. The years that followed were good ones. The farm prospered, and Henry and Sarah expanded their operations, purchasing more land and more cattle. They had 2 more children, a son named James, born in 1882, and another daughter, Catherine, born in 1884. The farmhouse rang with laughter and the sound of small feet running, and Sarah sometimes had to pinch herself to believe that this life was really hers. Linden grew and changed around them. The railroad came through in 1881, bringing new opportunities and new people. Sarah became active in the community, helping to organize a school and serving on the church council. She never forgot the dark time when she had been trapped and powerless, and she made it her mission to help other women in difficult situations. She worked with the marshal's office to identify and prosecute men who abused their wives or daughters, and she opened her home to women who needed a safe place to stay while they figured out their next steps. Henry supported her in all of this, proud of her strength and her compassion. He had become a respected member of the community himself, known for his honesty and his skill with horses. Young men sought him out for advice on ranching and life, and he was always willing to take time to help someone in need. Vernon Pierce died in prison in 1886, 7 years into his sentence. When Sarah received word of his death, she felt nothing but a distant relief that he could never hurt anyone again. That chapter of her life was so far behind her now that it seemed like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. She was no longer the frightened, desperate girl who had been forced into a nightmare marriage. She was Sarah Lawson now, wife and mother and landowner, strong in her own right and beloved beyond measure. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Henry surprised Sarah with a trip to Kansas City. They left the children with neighbors and took the train east, spending 3 glorious days exploring the city, eating at fine restaurants, and staying in a hotel that seemed impossibly luxurious. On their last night, as they walked along the river with the city lights reflecting off the water, Henry pulled Sarah close and kissed her temple. "Happy?" he asked softly. "So happy I sometimes cannot believe it is real," Sarah admitted, leaning into his warmth. "I wake up some mornings and have to remind myself that this is my life now, that I get to keep it." "You get to keep it," Henry assured her. You fought for it, you earned it, and no one can ever take it away. I am proud of you, Sarah Ramsey Lawson. Proud of the woman you are, proud to be your husband, proud of the life we have built together." Sarah turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, she smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "I love you, Henry Lawson. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, always and forever." They returned to the farm and to their children, to the daily rhythm of work and family and community. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and harvests, by new foals in the spring and snow in the winter. Emily grew into a bright, independent girl who loved horses as much as her father. James was quieter, thoughtful, with a gift for working with his hands. Catherine was the wild one, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, keeping her parents on their toes. Sarah's hair began to show threads of silver, and Henry's face gained lines from years of squinting into the sun. But their love never diminished, never grew stale or taken for granted. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when they thought the children were not looking, still talked late into the night about their dreams and fears and hopes. In 1895, Emily announced that she was engaged to the son of a neighboring rancher, a good young man whom Henry approved of and Sarah adored. The wedding was a big affair, with half the county in attendance, and watching her daughter marry for love, with no coercion or pressure, Sarah felt a sense of completion. The cycle had been broken. Her children would never know the fear and powerlessness she had experienced. They would inherit a legacy of strength and love, built on the foundation she and Henry had laid together. James left for university in Kansas City in 1897, determined to study law so he could help people the way the Marshal had helped his mother. Sarah cried when he left, proud and sad in equal measure, but knowing she had raised a good man who would make a difference in the world. Catherine showed no signs of wanting to leave the farm, declaring that she would be a rancher like her parents and never live in a city if she could help it. She had inherited her mother's determination and her father's way with animals, and Sarah had no doubt she would make a success of whatever she chose to do. As the new century approached, Sarah and Henry sat on their porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. They were both gray now, their hands marked by decades of hard work, their faces lined with years of laughter and tears. The farm spread out before them, green and thriving, a testament to everything they had built together. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, her hand clasped in Henry's. "You found me crying in the barn, lost and afraid and certain my life was over. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even with tears on your face," Henry replied. "And I remember thinking that whoever had put that look of despair in your eyes deserved to be horsewhipped." "You saved me," Sarah said softly. "You gave me back my life, my freedom, my future. Everything I have, everything we have built exists because you were brave enough to help me when I could not help myself." Henry shook his head. "No, Sarah, I just gave you the tools. You saved yourself. You were the one who had the courage to take the risk, to fight for your freedom, to build a new life from the ashes of the old. All I did was love you and stand beside you. The rest was all you." "It was us," Sarah corrected gently. "Together. It has always been us together, and that is what made it possible. I could not have done it alone, and neither could you. We needed each other, and we found each other, and that made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and from the barn came the soft sounds of the horses settling for the night. Inside the house, Catherine was cooking supper, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out through the open windows. This was home, Sarah thought. This was what she had fought for, what she had risked everything to achieve. Not just land or livestock or material wealth, but this sense of peace and belonging. The knowledge that she was loved and valued, that her voice mattered, that her life was her own to live as she chose. It had been a long, hard road from that day in the barn to this moment on the porch, but every step had been worth it. No regrets, Henry asked, as if reading her thoughts. Not a single one, Sarah said firmly. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear led me here to you, to this life. How could I regret that? Henry raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Here is to the next chapter, my love. May it be as blessed as all the ones that came before. To the next chapter, Sarah echoed, smiling. And to us, always. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Sarah Ramsey Lawson sat beside the man she loved and felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had been sold to a crooked land baron, had been trapped and powerless and alone. But a cowboy with kind eyes and a brave heart had bought back her freedom and her farm, and in doing so, had given her something far more precious, a love that would last a lifetime and beyond. The farm would pass to their children and their children's children, carrying forward the legacy of two people who had refused to give up, who had fought for justice and love and the right to choose their own path. And long after Sarah and Henry were gone, their story would remain, a testament to the power of courage and compassion and the unbreakable bonds of true love. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the land or the money or the hardships they had overcome, but the love they had built together, day by day, year by year, until it was as much a part of the landscape as the prairie grass and the endless Kansas sky. A love that had started in darkness and desperation had grown into something bright and enduring, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost or trapped or alone. Sarah had been broken once, shattered into 1,000 pieces by cruelty and injustice. But Henry had helped her gather those pieces and forge them into something new and stronger, tempered by fire and made whole by love. She was not the same person she had been in that barn all those years ago. She was better, braver, more fully herself than she had ever imagined possible. And as she sat there beside her husband, surrounded by the life they had built with their own two hands, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing. The pain had made the joy sweeter, the darkness had made the light more precious, and the struggle had made the victory worth celebrating every single day. This was her happily ever after, hard won and deeply cherished. This was the life she had chosen, the life she had fought for, the life she had earned. And it was more beautiful than any fairy tale because it was real, built on sacrifice and sweat, and the determination of two people who refused to let circumstances define them. The porch boards creaked as Henry shifted his weight, and Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling his arm come around her in a gesture as familiar as breathing. They had weathered storms together, literal and metaphorical, and had always emerged on the other side stronger and more united. That would not change, not as long as they both drew breath. Inside the house, Catherine called that supper was ready, and Sarah and Henry rose together, their hands still clasped, and walked into the warm, golden light spilling from the doorway. Behind them, the prairie stretched out in the darkness, vast and eternal, a witness to their story and a promise that some things, like love and hope and the human capacity for resilience, would endure long after they were gone. The door closed behind them, and the night settled over the farm like a blanket, peaceful and complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to be lived and savored. But tonight, the Lawson family gathered around their table together and whole, and that was enough. That was everything. Years later, when grandchildren came to visit and asked Sarah to tell them stories of the old days, she would smile and pull them close and tell them about the hardest time of her life and how love had saved her. She would tell them about a cowboy with kind eyes who had risked everything to help a stranger, about fighting for freedom and justice, about building a life from nothing with just determination and hope. And she would tell them with absolute conviction that love was worth fighting for, that freedom was worth risking everything for, and that they should never, ever settle for less than they deserved. She would tell them that they came from strong stock, from people who had faced down corruption and violence and emerged victorious. She would tell them that the farm they played on had been bought with courage and maintained with love, and that it was their inheritance not just of land but of values. The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, barely able to imagine a time when their grandmother had been powerless and afraid. To them, she was a force of nature, a woman who commanded respect and radiated strength. They could not conceive of her as anything less than the pillar of the community she had become, but Sarah remembered. She remembered the girl she had been, broken and desperate, and she was grateful for that memory because it reminded her never to take her freedom for granted. It reminded her to help others who found themselves in similar situations, to fight for justice wherever she found injustice, and to cherish the people she loved with every fiber of her being. Henry, too, grew old with grace, his body slowing but his mind and heart as sharp as ever. He remained Sarah's partner in all things, her confidant and her champion. Even when they were both too old to work the farm themselves and had to hire help, they remained involved, offering guidance and wisdom born of decades of experience. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1939, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. The farmhouse was full to bursting, and the celebration lasted well into the night. When the last guest had finally departed and the house was quiet once more, Sarah and Henry sat together in their bedroom, the same room they had shared for 50 years. "Quite a day," Henry said with a tired but satisfied smile. "Quite a life," Sarah corrected, taking his hand. "Thank you for giving it to me." "Thank you for sharing it with me," Henry replied. "I have been blessed beyond measure, Sarah. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." They fell asleep that night as they had every night for 50 years, wrapped in each other's arms, content and complete. And when Henry passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, Sarah grieved deeply but without regret. They had been given more time together than many people ever got, and they had made every moment count. Sarah lived on for 5 more years after Henry's death, remaining on the farm she loved and watching her great-grandchildren play in the same fields where she had once fought for her survival. She died peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer evening in 1946, surrounded by family and love, her life complete. The farm passed to Catherine, who had never left and never wanted to, and she maintained it with the same devotion her parents had shown. The story of Sarah and Henry became family legend, told and retold to new generations as a reminder of where they came from, and what their ancestors had sacrificed to give them the freedom they enjoyed. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the Kansas prairie, it was easy to imagine that somewhere in the rustle of the grass and the creak of the old farmhouse, the spirits of Sarah and Henry still walked together, forever bound by a love that had conquered darkness and emerged into the light, a love that would endure as long as the prairie itself, eternal and unbreakable and true.